My great pleasure to introduce Stacey Milbern. I have known her for a while. We first worked together on a preconception health project at the Oregon Health Division when I was at Portland State University with the Women with Disabilities Health Equity Coalition. And we were quite a team, and she has taught me a lot about disability justice. And so whenever I think about disability justice and who can, talk about it, I think of Stacey. And so really quite honored and pleased that Stacey is able to be with us today. She's a disability justice thought leader with 12 years experience incubating leadership programs, managing services programs, providing technical assistance to organizations wanting to increase the capacity around disability and diversity. She's queer, mixed race, disabled woman of color, and is passionate about advancing the leadership of disabled people of color. She has trained many community organizations and served as an appointed advisor to the Obama administration for 2 years. She currently works within the HR field, supporting employees with disabilities in pursuing accommodations, and has an MBA from Mills College. In her free time, she serves on the Special Hope Foundation Board of Directors, provides organizational support to Sins Invalid, a disability justice performance project, and enjoys exploring the San Francisco Bay Area. Will you welcome me in welcoming Stacey Milbern?
Let's see, I think I have to turn my mic on, right? Can folks hear me? Oh, cool. Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to meet you all. Thank you for coming out in the rain. I know it can take a lot of work to get places, so I really appreciate everyone being here. Okay, so slides. We're going to start today, actually a little bit about myself. So as Marjorie said, I've been working in disability rights, so civil rights for people with disabilities, and also disability justice, which we'll talk a little bit about what that is today. I'm passionate about living a good life. I think a lot of times in disability advocacy, we've done a lot of work around moving people out of institutions, and I'm really curious to also have conversations around how can we not just make that a geographic move, but make sure people are truly included in their communities and being able to actively participate and engage with the world. So yeah, that's kind of my life philosophy. This photo of me is at the butterfly house, and that's a butterfly sleeping on my shoulder. And then I'm also trying to figure out right now, I feel like I have a little bit of conflicting interests. So I'm working in the corporate sector around how to get companies to hire more people with disabilities. A little embarrassed to say this right now, but working at Wells Fargo in the corporate division. But also have this strong desire to do radical community organizing. So outside of that, also working with Sins Invalid, which is one of the few organized disability justice organizations. As a content notice, and I'm doing this content notice as a part of accessibility. Maybe folks are aware, but sometimes there is criticism around trigger warnings and things like that, but I do believe that they can be a helpful tool, especially if we want people with disabilities, maybe non-apparent disabilities, to be able to be in the room. So today we will be talking about things like eugenics, police violence, state-sanctioned violence, sexual violence, let's see what else, isolation, ableism, racism. So please do what you need to do to take care of yourself, even if that means leaving the room and coming back. I also wanted to do a quick access check-in. I wasn't planning to read the slides unless somebody needs audio description. Is there anyone that maybe has a visual disability and needs me to read the slides? Okay, cool. And then, so as an access check-in, are there any needs in the room that you want the group to know so you can fully participate?
I may stand up, my back's not feeling great. I'm paying as much attention wherever I am in the room.
Super, thank you. And feel free, everybody, to do that as well. Anything else? Cool. I do have one access need as a facilitator, is that I might have to step out the room spontaneously. So if we do a spontaneous group activity and I'm gone, I'll be right back. And then in terms of the plan, I will plan just to cover a few concepts, and then it's mostly a discussion, so we'll split up into small groups and then go from there. Is that cool for folks? Any questions before we begin? Okay, cool. So I want everybody to look around the room, and I just want to know, folks to take a little assessment and just notice who's not in the room. So who from our communities weren't able to be here and access the space today? And then I want to invite us all to close our eyes and just reflect on that for a minute. And maybe also think about what it would be like for them to be able to participate. What would that look like, feel like, sound like? Okay, and then I want you to keep your eyes closed. But let's transition to thinking about what have you been told about disability, and just think about some of the messaging and where you might have heard those things. And when you're ready, you can come back to the group. Well, thank you for doing that with me. Usually I describe it as a system of oppression that favors able-bodiedness and able-mindedness at the expense of people with disabilities, which is pretty much what you all said word for word. And it definitely is a system of oppression. So, for example, and it touches everything. I think of my flight here today. I flew in from SFO this morning, and it was a fine flight, nothing bad happened. But then if I am actually describing my experience, I would tell you that the airplane is not designed for people who use wheelchairs. So I have to be transferred into an aisle chair by strangers, which is very scary, having strangers touch your body. And you don't know if they're gonna listen to you, or it had to be transferred in public. So there were all of these strangers watching me. When I did go inside the plane, it wasn't comfortable, so my attendant was holding me for 2 hours. So when we talk about these kind of stories, a lot of times the person says, oh, you poor person, like, what a terrible experience. If you didn't have a disability, everything would be better. But in this particular instance, the thing that needs to change is the airlines. You know, they should have a wheelchair accessible space, just like trains and buses, and there's no reason really to do that if they wanted to make that change. So it's just an example of everyday ableism that people experience, or I experience. So examples of ableism, let's talk about this. Do people have an example of systemic ableism? And we want to keep it, the conversation kind of at a macro level. So looking at communities as a whole and not necessarily individual stories. but how does ableism play out in the world? So I heard one person say, valuing ability, so really promoting people who don't have disabilities. Heard another person say that, like deciding what is a good mind or a good body and a good way to move. What else?
I noticed recently that almost every place I've been that serves alcohol at a bar, the bar is too high for a person in a chair.
Totally, yeah. So just the physical accessibility of spaces can be not accessible, which is amazing 26 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act. Cool, what are some other examples? Yes?
I don't know if this is an example you're looking for, but as a feminist and someone who has had 2 abortions, I feel very challenged and like perceived by the rhetoric around abortion and reproductive rights as like a mechanism of, like one of the ways we talk about abortion, why it should be legal, is so we can terminate pregnancies that aren't quote unquote viable, including children with disabilities, fetuses that have disabilities. And I feel very personally conflicted by that.
Yeah, right on. I think that's where we have a lot, that is a movement that we have so much work to do around disability. It's a little bit scary, not a little bit, it's a lot of it scary to think about. Even things like prenatal testing, we want people to know all their options. And at the same time, are we gonna live in a world where 2 generations later, there aren't any people with Down syndrome? You know, and what are some of the values that people have around that and the messaging doctors give? I was speaking with a group of students this week, and it was a really awesome conversation because there were a lot of moms of color, and we were just talking about like the idea of being a good mom. If you have a kid with a disability and how much messaging you get around like not bringing that kid into the world. And again, we want people to have choices and options and control of their bodies. But when the people putting out the messaging aren't disability friendly, it's an issue. So I think of like my own story where my mother is Korean and my dad was in the army. And so a lot of times it was me and her going to doctors, and I spent decades mad at her because I would do all of these surgeries and go to physical therapy 3 times a week. And it didn't seem like it was about improving my quality of life, but it was more just like trying to make me look normal. So straightening my head or my ankle and all of this, and I didn't want to do it, I wanted to do other things. But when I was an adult, she explained that she was told like, you're a bad mom if you don't do this, and like, what is that like as a, you know, English second language speaker and Korean woman being told that, you know, you're hurting your child if you don't make them do this. And we need to really evaluate what role the medical industrial complex is playing around disability. It's really interesting, in Sweden or Switzerland, when a deaf child is brought into the world, the hospital invites the deaf community, and they come and they have a party and they say, you know, welcome to the deaf community, and you're gonna have an amazing experience, and you're gonna learn ASL, and like that such messaging is so different than messaging around you need to do cochlear implants and try not to teach sign language and assimilate and all these things. So yeah. What other examples can folks think of around how ableism plays out, either in our movements or organizations or society as a whole?
Segregation, and starting it like, I work a lot with families with kids with intellectual disabilities that automatically going into kindergarten, the expectation is it will be completely segregated.
Totally. So segregation as the tool of ableism. Yes.
The cure and readiness model, so that if I do more therapy, I will get you ready, you know, or if I, you know, only feed you certain foods or give you certain nutrients, you will be cured. And so this idea that you're on that hamster trail as a parent, believing that you do everything you have to do to cure or ready your child for whatever else, otherwise resulting in what Angela said, segregation. You obviously weren't cured and aren't ready.
Definitely. And it's not to say medical interventions or rehab are as bad, nothing like that, it's another tool. But when it's the only message people receive, it's problematic. What else? Yes,
Well, in every form of media we have, not only is able-bodiedness privilege, like podcasts aren't transcribed, movies aren't closed captioned, but then you almost never see disabled characters, and if you do, the actors aren't disabled. So you just keep seeing this reinforcement of non-disabledness and non-deafness as uplifted and worth viewing.
totally. And I think on top of that, what is the messaging around disability? So, does the disabled character always want to commit suicide? Do we ever get to see a person that wants to live? Is the person with a psychiatric disability always the villain? You know, you look, it's Halloween right now, look at all of the narrative around Halloween and what's scary, it's so ableist. Yeah, or inspiration porn, is that a term people have heard of? Okay, I see a lot of head nods. So yeah, the idea that people with disabilities exist to inspire able-bodied people. So it might be an internet meme of a girl with prosthetics running and it says, your excuse is invalid. You know, just things like that. And it's not, again, not to say people shouldn't be inspired, but when it's using disability and you don't really know that person's full story or if they wanted that messaging, I think that becomes an issue. 1 second, yes.
Or like off of that too, like the representation of folks with disabilities that are like magical or like somehow have superpowers because of their disability. So it's like raising up in like a non-real mythical way to dehumanize folks with disabilities.
Cool, can you think of an example for us?
I mean, terrible show, Game of Thrones. One of the kids in Game of Thrones has like an ability, but he's disabled. Thinking of other shows like Daredevil, lots of comics and superheroes and stuff like that, media.
Yeah. Yeah, you never just see disabled people in the background or as the leader. It's always they have a role to play. Cool, can you get something?
The higher risk of incarceration or police killing of people with mental health disabilities or in mental health crises as well.
Yeah, the Rudiment Foundation says that 50% of people killed by the police are people with disabilities as well. And a lot of it is around not knowing other community resources to call and over calling the police, and then people with disabilities seen as a threat or violent. Is a good reason. Yes?
I know that disability is considered immigration decisions, so if you have a disability, you can be barred from immigrating if they believe that you're going to become a public charge.
Totally.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that.
Totally.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how to exactly state this, but it really seems pervasive to me as a sense, kind of a limited view of what is possible for individuals with disabilities, whereas, you know, just general community can think of limitless things as far as creativity, science, technology, everything else, but as far as applying any of that limitless kind of perspective, it doesn't occur when they think about people with disabilities.
I think one of the biggest barriers people face is just low expectations. You know, if you're a young person with a disability, are people pushing you to be in after-school clubs and part-time jobs, or do they just expect you to go home and sit on the sofa and play Nintendo? Or I guess not Nintendo anymore. But yeah, it's a low expectations, and then that really, it becomes easy to internalize. Also, disability is always seen as an individual problem. So people don't understand it as a political community or social identity, anything like that, or even a social experience. So eugenics, we talked a little bit about this, but this is a poster, I believe, during it was for some international conference, I believe during the 20s or 30s. And I really like the way that it shows all the different ways eugenics work. So eugenics was this political movement and philosophy around let's encourage people with good genes to continue the race, and let's get rid of those degenerates. And the idea of who is a degenerate is really shaped by race and ability and class. It's so gendered. So what that might mean is a woman with a disability going to the hospital for a small procedure and finding out, that she's been sterilized without her consent, or it might mean even things like IQ tests in schools and how that classification would separate out students, things like that. And I think eugenics, so people think of eugenics as something that was created by Hitler and the Nazis, concentration camps and all of that, but it started here in the United States, and it was really active, is really active. To your point earlier, even Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger, a lot of the early reasons for increasing choice options was so that people with disabilities wouldn't continue generations and generations more of disability. So on this chart, you can see all the different tools of eugenics. So biology, anatomy, genetics, psychology, mental testing, anthropology, psychiatry, surgery. And I'm blown away by just how much eugenics touches or touched everything. So even stories around going to state fairs and being able to enter a contest where if you have the most fit family, you get an award. And of course, fit is white and able-minded and able-bodied and communicates a certain way, looks a certain way. So disability as a social construct. Can someone help us out and tell me what a social construct even means? Anybody?
A set of assumed agreements.
Assumed agreements, cool.
Set of rules that doesn't really have inherent value, but is based on rules that we made as a society.
Cool, so like rules of society. Great, anybody else? So one reason disability doesn't get talked about is people assume that we're all operating on the same definition. And really, we as society create the definition. It's not a biological definition. There's this idea of impairment versus disability. So for example, I have a physical impairment. That's like physiologically what's going on for me. But my disability comes from the way I experience barriers in society. So if society doesn't have those barriers, I'm a lot less disabled. If we lived in a world that was dark, then blind people wouldn't be as disabled. But we live in a world that is really inaccessible to people with visual impairments. Does that make sense for folks? Okay, cool. So this is a quote. It is society that causes the individual with physical or psychological differences to be disabled. In other words, individuals with impairments are not disabled by their impairments, but by the barriers that exist in society constructed to the norm. And I think that's a really important concept to hold on to, because when we're leading organizations, that means we have the power and the responsibility to really shape how people with disabilities experience those. So if the space is really accessible, I know I feel a lot more empowered and in my personal power to do things. But if there's a lot of barriers, then obviously it doesn't have the same impact. Any thoughts about this? So models of disability. This was made by Dr. Drew Gosling in the UK. And when we say models of disability, there are different ways to think about disability. So one way is the charity model. That's the Barbies with the dresses on. And in that model, disability is something that able-bodied people work to eradicate through charity. And so it's not really about recognizing people as peers or empowered people, but more as like objects to give to. So I think we still see that. It was really a common example might be Jerry's Kids. So the Labor Day telethon, and Jerry Lewis was quoted as saying all these horrible things like, if you don't want pity, stay at home, and not really allowing people to be in their power. And then there were a lot of disability advocates. So Jerry Lewis was doing a telethon where he was raising money for people with muscular dystrophy. And the way he did it was by telling really, really sad stories. And so people would say, how can I go and interview for this job when yesterday you just told people I can't leave the house and I'm never going to amount to anything, and the only way they can help me is by giving you money. So it's a really problematic model where people with disabilities are always put in the receiving role and not really in charge of the messaging put out around them. And yeah, charity model. Another model is the medical model. And medical model is like we were talking about, focus is on the disability as a problem. And it says if we can get rid of the disability, that's how we create change. So when you see organizations like Autism Speaks, where everything is about let's raise money to get rid of autism, that is a very medical way of thinking, where the disability is something to get rid of. The social model, which is a Xena Barbie, flips the medical model on its head and says disability is created by an inaccessible society. So if I, as a wheelchair user, go to the bank and there are stairs, the solution to that problem isn't for me to go get surgery and get rid of my wheelchair. The solution is let's have that bank be wheelchair accessible. So the social model was kind of the foundation for disability rights and saying like we need to change society for everyone to be included. So this image is a Valentine's Day card. It says, I want to make you a part of my routine. And it was made by an autistic blogger. Neurodiversity, I wanted to bring this up because too often we just focus on physical access. And really we also need to be evaluating able-mindedness and how does society perpetuate like all of these ideas around how a brain should function. So how do people move through the world, engage with the world, communicate with others, process information. If you're an organization where, so I'm in one organization where they have a lot of conflict right now because they sent out the agenda for the meeting at 3 a.m. the night before. And all the people are like, this isn't like accessible to neuroatypical people because we need time to look at the agenda, think about things, and then in the conversation about that experience, the conversation went really fast, and there were like 10 people talking, no time to really think about it. So that's another expectation where we're really thinking, we're really expecting people to think in a certain way, at a certain speed, in a certain format, and that can really exclude a lot of folks. So neurodiversity is this concept that says it's just a part of human diversity. We all think differently, emote differently, move through the world differently, and that is just what it is, which I think is really cool. There's a video by this woman, Amanda Baggs, on YouTube. It's like 9 minutes long, that's why I didn't play it. But in it, it's completely silent, and you see her doing things like running her hand on the bed sheet, or playing with water under the faucet, or touching the blinds on the window. And you don't really understand what she's doing. And it's behavior that usually gets read as purposeless, but then at the end she says that she's a nonverbal autistic person, and that's how she communicates with the world. So it kind of just opens your mind to thinking a little bit more about what are all the different ways people communicate and process information. Any thoughts about neurodiversity? And we're going to get to small groups soon so people can talk. Spoiler alert, have folks seen Finding Dory? Okay, so in the movie there is a scene where Dory the bluefish has a memory impairment and her family's always worried she's going to get lost. So this is really a spoiler alert. Because at the end of the movie she does get lost and the whole movie is her trying to find home. And then you find out at the end that her parents have been collecting shells their whole life so that she has a path to go back home. And I just really like that as a concept of collective access around how can we make sure that people can really be a part of our communities. And a lot of times it's creative and things you haven't thought of before but people need. And it's done out of love and you want people to be included, which feels a little bit different than accommodation conversations, which people have a legal right to, as long as they're quote unquote reasonable. When we say collective access, we're saying as a group, we commit for people with disabilities and all people to be involved. So what do we need to do to make that happen? So a few ways to make that happen. Accessible information. Someone brought up before, so image descriptions or accessible formats. So if you put out a poster for your event, if it's a PDF where people can't read the text, then somebody with a screen reader is not going to be able to access it. So a lot of times organizations might put out a JPEG image and then not describe it. So that means the blind person has no idea what that image is about. So even on our websites and our Facebook events profiles, we need to do more image descriptions so people can access that information. Captioning, if you put out a movie, YouTube video, it really needs that captioning. So like that's not an option anymore, not for that happen. And it's a symbol and aspect of collective access. Readability. So a lot of times we put out information and you have to have a PhD to be able to read it. So for our communities to really be able to grasp and have access to that information, can people understand it? If you use Microsoft Word, there's a built-in tool that you can turn on and it'll tell you the readability level. And you want to try to aim at around 8th grade level. That's what newspapers aim for, and I feel like newspapers are still hard to read. So, American Sign Language, if people need that. And with things like ASL, American Sign Language, Braille, you really got to think about access in the beginning. So that's saying you want to bake it into the cake rather than trying to add it on top later. If you didn't plan for ASL and you're organizing an event, then it's really hard to come up with that money at the end. But if you think about access in the beginning and plan it, put it in your budget, then the resources are there to make your event accessible. Accessible spaces. So a big one is scent-free access. Are familiar with that? Are people familiar with that? So a lot of people can get really sick for days or have seizures if they're exposed to fragrances. And it's unfortunately a huge barrier because people end up not being able to go to community events and spend a lot of time in isolation at their own homes. So if people can be more aware of that, as an organization, it might mean you're hosting an event, so you ask the building a week in advance, can you use scent-free hand wash, scent-free cleaning supplies, our organization will pay for it. But kind of thinking about that in advance. If you're putting out invitations, ask people to be scent-free, include a link about what that means. That would be a big game changer for people with chemical sensitivities.
So a couple of things that we discussed were in the topic of how do we, the first question, who's not here, and how do we create allyship situations and inclusive allyship situations. People, the leadership positions are critical in changing norms. We noticed that there don't appear to be any people here who are deaf who are using ASL interpreters. Presumably, we think everyone here is speaking English. And one of the things we talked about was making a space in meetings to say what people need for the best experience, and not just calling it out, but asking every individual person speaking to do this, and that the leader has the power to model this, and to kind of challenge the norm of not being vulnerable by being vulnerable and stating what they need for the best meeting environment, for example, or learning environment. And have ways to address conflicting needs, and with the fear of offending people, it's important to invite people with access needs into planning to try and address problems before they arise, or conflicts or barriers. Understanding that no one is an expert on everyone. No one person knows everything, and that acknowledging people's needs as an open question is really helpful. What do you need to best achieve the common goals of this group? And we talked about doing these as a practice rather than normalizing this. So rather than normalizing asking people about needs, we adopt it as a cultural practice. And how there's a difference in normalizing versus practicing community. And that even though there's a fear about maybe adopting these, that often that fear comes from a lack of practice, and the best way to do it is to start doing it. Periodic, regular assumption check-ins as well, asking if there are any assumptions that people made unconsciously or consciously that can be addressed and re-examined to change norms of a group. Naming your own knowledge and adding it to the conversation. We also recognize that we're not young kids here, and know people who really present as like elders. Also, in terms of organizations, how do we create more leadership opportunities in organizations? Some echoing of what you were saying earlier, preparing, having alternative materials ready for people who need them, and to adapt the speed of meetings to meet the needs of whoever is possible. That these are foundations to inviting more people with disabilities into leadership positions. That these aren't things that are expected of people with disabilities in leadership positions to facilitate themselves. That wasn't exactly what we said, but that's kind of and practice opening meetings with check-ins about what people need to participate fully. Don't assume, just practice, regardless of what kind of organization you're working in. Don't assume, just practice. Again, practice in culture rather than normalize, making it into culture, and new stories.
Wow, you guys set a high bar. That's great. What a thorough conversation. Do folks have questions or points they want to expand on? Yes.
Could you clarify the last thing? No stories? Could you just...
New stories.
Oh, new stories.
New stories.
Can you talk about what the difference of normalizing versus practicing community is in your group? That was really intriguing. I want to hear more about that.
I think the idea there is when we say normalizing, the word normal conveys a value. A practice is not, a practice is a practice. There's no good or bad, abnormal, or normal, abnormal. There's no value judgment to practice. So if you adopt something as a practice, and you make that as a regular practice, it's not, we're getting away from the idea that, oh, well, that's normal, because then there's something else that's abnormal. And I think that's a dynamic that we're trying to get away from in this entire conversation.
Thank you.
We also talked about ranking people as creating more exclusion, and that not ranking people is a way of creating more inclusion. Historically, the word normal came into dominance in the early 1800s, especially by statisticians who are also eugenicists. And so the idea of a normal culture is really rooted in eugenics as well. And so to work for a cultural practice is a way to kind of incorporate personal responsibility with community access, rather than trying to make a normal, because not every person knows what everybody is going to need. And so if we have a practice that holds space for people's needs, it's different than having a normal that says everybody's welcome here, for example.
And it allows the space for mistakes to be okay. We're just practicing it.
Cool. Any other questions or feedback for this group? I do want to expand on the access check-in because that's a great tool. What I usually suggest is if you're facilitating a workshop or event where people will be doing introductions, then it's a good idea to go ahead and do preferred pronouns and also access check-ins. So when people go around, they can just say if they have any access needs. If it's a large group like today where we didn't have space to do introductions, that's when I do just a general, please let me know if you need anything. If you don't feel, I didn't say it today, but if you don't feel comfortable saying it to the whole group, you can come to me privately or another person privately. And having that as a regular practice does open the door not just for people with disabilities, but I think we need to expect all people to have needs, whether that's because people are parents, English as a second language, all kinds of reasons that it's important to make that for everyone. Cool. Who wants to go next? Thank you, group. Yay! How would you all feel going?
I can go. I'm Kaylee, and our group talked about some of the things that you talked about. I really like that practice versus normalized piece. That's great, and I didn't, that's something as someone who engages in equity work and things, I never even thought of that. So that's a really fantastic piece. But I think that goes along with we were talking about checking our own privilege and folks who identify as not having a disability, making sure that you check your own privilege day to day. Like when you were telling the story about the getting on the plane, that's not something I have to think about. That's not something that I've thought about really, and recognizing that so that that's kind of a constant in my brain, making sure that I keep holding space for folks that I don't normally hold space for. I think that's really important to kind of start those practices. It keeps that in the back of your head so that you can recognize when a practice might be needed, when you need to have those access check-ins and things. We talked about at an organizational level, the communication that organizations have with disability communities and disability justice movements. Kind of like a consensus among us was kind of how do organizations tap into those communities and figure out how to work with them and what they need and how to get them to contribute. But so there's that piece, and there's this other piece of well, the organization should kind of do their work too, and so it's kind of a two-way street, but the organization needs to do their work. They need to do their own research, they need to do their own education, maybe based off of things that are already out there that are from those organizations, and then come to the organization with, you know, we would like you to be involved in this, what would that look like for you, rather than what would that look like for us, for you to be involved in it. I think also we were talking about, what else were we talking about?
About relationships between each other and what we can offer each other as a starting place of allyship. How do we use our power and privilege as people and organizations to serve each other to start with?
Yeah, and how we can take our privilege and use it in a way that's constructive rather than helplessness around issues, and also kind of like listening and validating and not overstepping and defending or anything like that. Just listening and validating folks in other communities and disability communities with those things.
And we talked about it wasn't just a one-way street, but the people with disabilities also need to reach out. And because a lot of times, we have quite talked that the different agencies didn't know where to reach out. But we also, I mean, me as a person with a disability, as you can see, we have some responsibility as well. So we talked quite a bit about this two-way.
Cool. Anything else from this group? Any questions or feedback?
Oh, one more thing that I forgot that I felt was really important. We were talking about in the public health sector how it comes down to like what you were saying about how it's a problem that needs to be eradicated, or it's an abnormality, is what I hear a lot in my work with the state with public health, is anomalies, or that's something they're working on now, is birth anomalies, and that's always rubbed me the wrong way. But the ranking of my position with public health, it doesn't really allow me to like voice that. So I think that piece, and then it always comes back to money. So how is, Heather brought up a good point, saying how much does disabilities cost this organization every year? How much does folks with fetal alcohol syndrome spectrum of disorders cost the public? What does it cost the public? So it's kind of this like, we want to get our costs down in regards to disabilities. So folks with disabilities are being valued in a very negative way.
Totally.
I'd just like to share something with feedback that I heard, and I think it was something that you had said, and it just kind of resonated with me from like a strength-based approach, and just honoring the fact that yes, we all have needs and we all have gifts as well, and so like kind of in this practice idea of starting off a meeting, and if you had the time and space to like, you know, let us know what needs you have and also what gifts you have, because it's an opportunity to honor that each of us have these unique gifts and these needs as well, and so it's a way of bringing a strength-based approach and a positive light to our unique selves.
Yeah, one prompt that I like in smaller groups is, what can we expect from you? And then people say, I really like to make people feel welcome, or I really like to help keep things together.
You probably could get some negative things that people would share from an expectation standpoint.
Yeah, it's a lot of how you frame it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool. What I really like about what your group said, so there's multiple strategies for increasing access. One is definitely getting more disabled people in positions of influence. And then, as you mentioned, the labor shouldn't always be on people with disabilities. We wouldn't want people of color to always be the ones doing anti-racism training. Same thing, disabled people shouldn't always be the only ones being access coordinators. That's real labor, thank you. And then, yeah, cool, great, thank you. Yes, who wants to go next? And actually, before we go to the next group, a few things that came to mind. I think there's this idea of like hyper able-bodiedness or able-mindedness, especially in social justice communities where you prove your worth by working like 60-hour weeks. and it's like really leads to burnout. And when we think about creating accessible communities as part of it, around how can we make our movements sustainable for people. So that's one piece. And then the other piece to name is just noticing where are the really deep intersections where disability absolutely must be a part of the conversation. So for example, with CSA, child sexual abuse, they say 1 in 3 young people with disabilities experience CSA, compared to 1 in 10 young people without disabilities. So if you're doing CSA work, that's like absolute must that disability has to be a part of the conversation. Otherwise, there's no way we can combat that. Thank you. So next group.
I've just been volunteering. I'm gonna stand because I can project better. If anyone has trouble hearing me, just let me know. So some of the things that our group talked about, or we talked about the need to have people with disabilities in all levels of leadership within organizations providing services to communities of people with disabilities. We also talked about supporting people with disabilities that are in groups, supporting each other, and not necessarily a 501c3, not necessarily a formal organization that can apply for grants and get specific funding. We talked about the need to collaborate among communities and some of the parallels and challenges of ageism and ableism and the aging and disability communities working together. And we also talked about the need to work on an agenda that includes all of us and that uplifts the voices of everyone in the disability community, not just people who already have privilege and power within the community. Did I miss anything?
You did great.
Thank you.
We can talk a little bit about identifying where voices could be heard. Like.
Say more.
Well, we were talking about not going on the assumption that people just know how to get the message out or know where the most efficient place to share messages or know when their voice might be heard in Salem and can prepare to go there, or just trying to identify where you have the likelihood of your signal getting through the noise the best, I guess. And then how to support people getting their message to the signaling access point.
Any thoughts from that group?
One other thought was what can instigate our forming allies, and so there was a little bit of conversation about funders influencing proposal processes by asking how many members of your staff and board are individuals experiencing disability. That's an instigator to making sure that our organizations are really the people that they're trying to serve, not people not in leadership trying to serve somebody else. And then also the idea of that same process is now calling upon us more and more to do our work in partnership and in ally relationships with others. And so while we still, I was saying that it's easier for me to write for a grant that I have to be solely responsible for, but we do get more social change when we lock arms and work together. And so that funding process can be one of those instigators for us forming stronger allied relationships.
Great. What I really liked about that too is I think you spoke to the need of more data. So people with disabilities need to be counted. I know that in Oregon you all have the Real D data collection around public health, and we need funders and government and all the powers that be to see how people with disabilities are impacted in communities, and part of that is organizations reporting that and collecting that information. So in your intake paperwork or advocacy, are you asking people how they identify? Cool, thanks. And I don't want to lose your question. My response around how to identify where to put the signal would be, is really context-based. So it matters like what is your goal and what is the strategy. So I think it might be different for different situations. Cool. Any other questions for this group or feedback?
So I didn't share this in the group, and it's something I struggle with. I like the way the question is framed, how can we be allies to each other? But often when I hear allies, it's in the context of, you know, the privileged group being allies with and to me, that power dynamic right there makes me, as a person of color, really uncomfortable. It makes people with disabilities that I know really uncomfortable, and so I just want to throw that out there.
Right.
Because I think I think it's part of that, like, what is normal, who has power, who has access.
Totally, and it also invisibilizes like all the resources and relationships that really brilliant communities have to offer each other. Right? The other thing I like about what your group said was people with disabilities at all levels. So not just leadership levels, but entry levels, internships, you know, really working to cultivate the leadership of people with disabilities. That's cool. Great, next group. Thank you, group. Let's make our way around the circle, so y'all are next.
So our group talked about making sure that you are willing to go to the signal, wherever that may be, in order to get a true relationship building structure put into place, as opposed to having the expectation that your allies will come to you if you just make that announcement, if you're looking for them. That training staff are looking beyond what they see in front of them is vital and crucial to being able to create these relationships. That shouldn't fall just upon any particular segment of the workforce, that it should be everyone. That we need to do, and I'm going to try not to repeat what's been said. I think we need to do a better job of explaining all of the options that are available to individuals and understanding and making sure that they understand what choices they have before they choose to participate. And I think one of the ones that I'm taking home is making sure that access is a part of your cost of doing business as opposed to an afterthought. Doing more upfront to understand your own limitations to the work that you do and to the communities that you serve. Making sure that you have symbols that allow for people to understand where those safe zones are, and the examples were Black Lives Matters poster, rainbow.
Great, thank you.
That's my group of disabilities.
Any questions or feedback for this group? Thank you. Yeah, I love the idea of just adding it to the overhead. You gotta pay rent, you gotta have money for accommodations too. Cool. Okay, so I believe we have one group left and you guys have 3 minutes.
We can do it in 3 minutes. Because I'm using the captioner, I offered to do the notes. That's bringing my strength to the group. So I'm just going to do some bullet point reporting here. We talked about the need to look at the multiple levels of disenfranchisement in order to think about bringing people who's not in the room. So disability and race, disability in class, looking at employment, who's employed and who isn't, who's getting paid to be at that meeting, who's not. Need to do some deep community work in order to really, do what it takes to be inclusive. They talked about the importance. I think this is the theme we're all coming up with, changing norms, dominant culture norms. So changing the room, changing who we invite, having food, changing the time, of the meeting, the place of the meeting, so it's accessible.